This session's, I think, a really important one for me. It's on tomorrow's leaders and how to develop them. I think it's very easy as business leaders, entrepreneurs, HR professionals to fall into all sorts of stereotypes about younger workers. I think we can acknowledge that they're looking for different things and we need to understand them better, and I think that's what Catherine is going to tell us about here today. So let me set this session up properly. During this session we'll learn about the pressures Gen Z and millennials are real. After navigating their way through the pandemic, they're now examining their career trajectory and confronting a range of new challenges: an uncertain economy, global unrest, a lack of affordable housing, and a threat of AI disrupting their jobs. All the things that Linda Duxbury was speaking about this morning. How can employers put future leaders on a path for success? In this session, Catherine Tremblay, the co-founder and owner of Altus Recruitment and Technology, will share strategies for employers to hire, train, and retain members of the upcoming generation. I think everybody knows Catherine, but I'm gonna read your bio. Just hold on here. Catherine is an award-winning Canadian entrepreneur and staffing enthusiast with over 35 years, specializing in human resources. I think of her truly as one of the great HR leaders of the city. In 2021, it seems like so long ago, Catherine, maybe we need to give you another CEO of the Year award. But she was the recipient of CEO of the Year with Ottawa Business Journal and the Board of Trade. It was fantastic, recognized as well in 17 years in running of Canada's best managed companies. In May 2024, after appointing a new CEO, it's a very interesting transition time for you personally, to lead her firm through its next phase of growth. Catherine transitioned into a new strategic role as co-founder and owner, where she focuses on building the brand, mentoring, developing leaders, growing careers, and providing strategic advice to the executive leadership team. Please give a warm welcome to Catherine Tremblay.
Those introductions always make me sentimental. You know, you almost see your whole life just come together in that way. So generations, look, I'm a People magazine person a little bit, okay? So I like to study birth order theory. How many times I've talked about that with my friend Barb, and I'm a middle child. I like talking about the past, the history of work and the future of work. And so generations kind of lands in that space, and it's one of my favorite subjects. And I think it's because a lot of times I hear from, I debated it this week with my daughter, do generations actually matter? And to me, in interviews, I think anyone here in the room who's interviewing routinely, you observe and notice that these generational things happen. And for those that debated me this week and said, no, generations don't apply, I had to bring up COVID. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna bring up the subject we all hate. But how many of you are interviewing and noticing that young people who lived through COVID, they were at the end of high school, or they were at the middle point of university or college, or they were just graduating? And when you talk with them about what happened and you say, how did COVID affect you? They tell you that there was this massive pivot in their life. They had to change locations, maybe they moved home. All these things occurred to them that they didn't expect, and they had a trajectory, they had a path, and many of you probably know young people who are suffering with some kind of shift they made that wasn't their original intention. So, you know, when we go on and we look at one generation to the next, we're always annoyed, aren't we? We're always annoyed by the next generation, saying, well, that generation did this or that. And I think that obviously is going to continue, but think about baby boomers who think that my generation X, you know, perhaps we were unprofessional. And Generation X thinks that, you know, maybe millennials had it easier than we did because they got the jobs ahead of us. And then maybe we all think that Gen Z is entitled, or perhaps they don't want to work as much. And I don't believe any of those things. All the negative things that we say about Gen Z, I have such a different experience with it. And I think it's because when we study and we look at Gen Z, what they're experiencing is so profound. You know, they're saying, I don't want to climb the ladder. And why don't they want to climb the ladder? Because they watched all of us climb the ladder and they're not sure it's what they intended or what they would like for their own lives. And then you look at the housing situation, and so many are furious and angry and upset by not being able to buy a house. I think it was something like 80% of young people being really alarmed by it and staying home so much longer. And if they're disillusioned by not being able to buy a house, then why do they want to climb a corporate ladder if they're not going to achieve that dream? And finally, and more importantly on this point, is that I often hear from people saying, well, Gen Z doesn't want to work as much. They want to work less. And I'm going to say that I don't think it's because they're lazy or entitled. I think they have good reason. First of all, 40% of Gen Z have a second job. Think about that. 40% have a gig job, they have a side hustle. They have to work less hours in their core job because they need a second job to deal with inflation. That's not because they want to work less, it's because they're working more to achieve the same thing that the baby boomers might have achieved with only one job. And in my day, if someone had a second job and they were moonlighting, as we call it, we would say something like, oh, you know, their core employer isn't paying them enough. But that's not the case anymore. It's really that they need the second job. And now you're thinking, what about the other 60%? Maybe they're the ones that are lazy and entitled. But I don't believe that either, because I think a lot of times that group is looking at their work-life balance. And if COVID taught them something, they're saying, I want to live and work, and I'm looking for that integration. I know we've all heard it before, but that integration is so important. So today we are going to talk about hiring and training and retaining Gen Z and millennials. And I say millennials, but I kind of refer to the second half of millennials, you know, that kind of under 35-year-old group, because that's where I see the big shifts in the interviews that we host. So let's do a quick recap. I don't know if you did this already this morning with Linda Drexler, but let's do a fast recap on generations, and then we'll keep plugging ahead, okay? I have to say, I think I love this subject because I think of my parents in the silent generation. And my mom and dad, you can't even watch a movie with them on your phone. You have your device out, and they're like, I'm not watching this with you because you're not following the plot, and why do you have a device? And they really are about traditional values, and they were such that they were able to look ahead, buy that house in the suburbs, and they were called silent because post-World War II and the Depression, they weren't able to really be fully self-expressed as we are today. I would choose where we are today with self-expression for sure. And so they were silent, they were conformist, they were traditional. They always tell me, we've talked about this before, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. It was all about the values of what things looked like in society. And then we advanced to baby boomers. And you know, I often think that we're jealous of baby boomers. I hate the word jealousy because I don't really espouse values around jealousy, but I do think we're a bit jealous of baby boomers because they had the dream. Like, suddenly there was this massive boom of babies, there's all these jobs available, there's an upward trajectory for them. Everyone is watching the same show. I don't know how many people here watch Disney at 6 p.m. every Sunday. I mean, that was definitely me. And so, you know, we watched the same shows and it made us optimistic. You know, because in that baby boom stage where everyone's the same, you're meeting your partner through friends and through family, not like today where everything is virtual. 61% of people are meeting online. Did any of you see that recently on Instagram? Did you guys see that? 60, yeah, so interesting. So you have these baby boomers who are now the CEOs where they had that optimism and they're making decisions for the generation that is today. But their point of reference is very different than the one that we have now. Now, I'm in Gen X. And before I talk about my generation, I have to say, we were that sandwich generation that was kind of the forgotten generation. The reason is that if you look at the data, so this is US data. I actually couldn't find Canadian data, but it's about 10%. So there were 46 million babies that were silent gen. And then there was 77 million baby boomers. Can you imagine that massive, like almost 30 million people boom? That's incredible. And then the bust was my generation, where there were only 55 million people born. And that bust meant that my generation kind of got a little lost. The baby boomers got all the jobs and we were kind of right underneath them. So we had to create our own jobs. A lot of people in my generation started businesses, went into sales, went into roles that they could kind of create their own future. So my Gen X generation, we were that sandwich kind of forgotten generation. And it took us 30% longer to achieve a promotion. Because right underneath us, the millennials, they were 66 million. So think about it, 76, 55, and back to 66. It was really that big lull. So a lot of the great jobs went directly from the what am I saying? Sorry, the baby boomers, and then down and then right back up. Thanks for that, Michael. Anyway, so Gen Xers certainly suffered a little bit through that, except that they became very entrepreneurial and fiercely independent, you know, the latchkey kids. So we get on and we go to millennials. Okay, so millennials, very cool. They have the opportunities, but they're starting to question whether they actually want those jobs. They don't have the rose-colored glasses. Those that were 20 years old at the end of, just as 9/11 was happening, they saw that uncertainty occurring around them. The economic promise was certainly not as certain for them. And so you look at some of their characteristics, and they're very collaborative, definitely. They love to work with others. But they also dealt with that mid-career everything. Mid-career AI threats, mid-career inflation. Many of them put off having children, put off getting married. And so there's that context for the millennial. And now we go to Gen Z, and this is where I kind of lean into this, is that we often give Gen Z a bad rap, and yet they're the next generation that we're embracing to bring into our companies. With 1,000 people retiring every single day in Canada, we really need our Gen Zs, don't we? So the first thing I think of when I think of Gen Zs is how technology is all they know. Well, I read a book some years ago. It was called Driven by Distraction, and it was actually about ADHD. But how with ADHD, we often, are driven by the distractions that occur around us. But I find today that even if you don't have ADHD, you're driven by the distractions of technology. I mean, every day. I mean, we're using Crave and Hulu, and then we're on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, and it's every moment of our day that is just so terribly distracted. And in my day, there was Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and today there's Mothers Against Media Addiction. It's called MAMA, M-A-M-A. You got to look it up. Mothers Against Media Addiction. It's worth looking for, because all of us, I think, will be leaning into that. I have 4 daughters, and I certainly worry about that media addiction. We're all addicted, but it just keeps becoming more and more prevalent. And if we keep going a little bit on Gen Zs, the promise of a home, many, like we said, are living at home much longer. Almost 35% are living with their parents 3 and 4 years longer than they did only a generation ago. That's really something, isn't it? They're dealing with uncertainty in the wars, and everything that the pain of violence around us brings to us, and the alarming elements that we bring when we read the news. But then hang on, they read the news, and CNN last year had that episode where they showed that 20% of what we see on TikTok are bots, chats, and completely fake. So here, not only are we dealing with all of the terrible things that hurt us as we see them, but then add to that, not half, but 20% is completely misinformed. And how do we know what's misinformed? And as employers, what are we seeing is that we're being compared to a TikTok. And the TikToks say all these things with advice about careers, but is any of it true? Is it even achievable? Very big question mark. And finally, before I really do need to move on here, but I love the subject, so I keep going, is that I find Generation Alpha super interesting. If you're trying to remember the generations, think X, Y, Z. So I'm the X, the Y is the millennial, and then Z being the generation we're talking about today. And Alpha, just as the millennial starts again, they started back at A with the Greek alphabet, Alpha. So if you're trying to remember X, Y, Z, and Alpha being next. So when you think of Alpha, I was reading last week that in New York City, they're not even putting kitchens in apartments anymore because they use Uber Eats and every other delivery service. There will be robots making our food and being delivered by autonomous vehicles. And their entire life will be device to human and human to device. I mean, ask Alexa and Hey Siri, but well beyond that, it'll keep going. I was surprised to learn that 50% of children have virtual play dates. And they're in Minecraft and everywhere else, and it's a virtual play date instead of an in-person play date. This is not something that I knew growing up. And so the whole live experience has completely changed, hasn't it? And so what will that mean to that generation that doesn't cook, doesn't know how to use a phone, and is doing everything virtually? Fascinating. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is actually just get into why we're here, to talk about hiring and retaining employees, especially of Gen Z. But first, I have to take one quick glance at work and the history of work. So if we look back at Henry Ford 100 years ago, 1926, Henry Ford wanted everybody to use their car on the weekend. And most people were working in factories, 5, 6, and 7 days a week. So, well, mostly 6 and 7. So they weren't actually driving on the weekend. And he needed people to use the cars. So he started that kind of momentum and movement towards the weekend. So now all of a sudden you have this structure where, admittedly, it's a very gendered comment I'm about to make, but men and dads were going out of the house, Then the weekends were with the family, and the mom was at home. So the entire model that we live on today is based on this model of how it looked then. And then we get into the 1970s, and it was still mostly men with some secretarial staff. My grandmother had to leave her job as soon as she got pregnant because she wasn't allowed to work pregnant. Interesting. It's sad, too. Anyway, you see the ashtray and the big phone, and then we get into today, where 40% of people can work anywhere. That's amazing. I mean, as long as you have Wi-Fi, you're totally portable. That didn't exist then. And we think, oh, that's a good thing. Maybe it is. But there's also the blurred lines of work and home completely gone. And the thing that's bugging me is that the model that Henry Ford espoused and that we all bought into and that we created worked in the gendered days of men going out and women staying home and working a 40-hour work week and going out to work. But today, how many single parents are there? How many dual parents are working outside the home? It's hard work. I know how that feels. I became a single mom when my husband passed away and then had these 4 kids to finish raising. They were from 9 to 19. It was something. But our work model wasn't built for the single mom. And yet, here we're talking about Gen Z so disillusioned. But they're having to deal with a model that was built 100 years ago that doesn't really work that well. And I'm not saying I have the idea of what it should be. Is it a compressed work week? Is it something? But I think it's time for us to re-examine the possibilities for how the model of work could shift to the generations. So now let's talk about what we're here to talk about and why it's important, is that for every moment that we talk about, the next generation not meeting our needs or that they're entitled or whatever, is that with everyone retiring, we have no choice but to lean in and bring them in. So that's why I really want to encourage everyone here to get really aligned with all the possibilities for that. So top 3 priorities for this generation, no surprise, of course, compensation, but it's not just compensation. It's the total compensation, including benefits. We'll talk about that in a minute. Obviously, flexibility, and we don't only mean flexibility of work location, flexibility of hours, flexibility of when the work is being done. Could they work a half day in the morning and a little bit later and deal with picking up their kids at school? Whatever that looks like is the total notion of flexibility. And then learning and development. But I want to emphasize something with learning and development. With millennials and Gen Z, it's not that they're only looking for learning. They actually want learning that's going to give them a bigger paycheck. So it's really aligning what are the skills they're earning that could also provide them with higher pay, because compensation being such a big difficulty. And then let's just get right into the tips to recruit. So first of all, let's talk about societal impact. We all talk about it, so I don't want to go crazy on it, but it's that visible notion of like the visible actions towards diversity and inclusion. It's not enough to post an Orange Shirt Day post. Did you actually read number 92? Are you really leaning into the Truth and Reconciliation report? Is it performative or is it real? It's the visibility and actions and demonstrated behaviors around the planet and climate action. For the first time recently, I had someone say to me, please show me your climate plan, because I'll only be able to join your firm if you have one that I believe in. It's the first time I ever had that happen, but I thought it was very, very interesting. So next up, let's talk about career paths. But there's 2 career paths we have to talk about. Has anyone read the Globe and Mail recent article called Conscious Unbossing? Have you heard it? It's like conscious, what was it called, uncoupling? Remember those days with Gwyneth Paltrow? So conscious unbossing means that 50% of Gen Z and the lower part of millennials are saying, I don't want to be a boss. Not interested in leading people. Show me the path how I can earn more money, gain more skills. I don't want to be a leader. That's really interesting too, because as we all retire and we need these young people to come up and take our jobs, if they don't want to lead, why not? So when you look at what Shopify did, kind of similar is what I'm saying here, is really showing 2 paths in your HR model. So the career development path that has the job titles that go up, and the career path that has the job titles going in a more linear way, but that still shows the possibility for earning more income and gaining more skills. Now, the next one, when we talk about closing that gap, and I say COVID 2+1, it might be 2+2, but COVID changed how people learned and their entire trajectory, right? Some of the students didn't get co-ops. Some of the co-ops never got jobs. A lot of disillusionment in that 3-year period. A lot of the education wasn't very good in that period either. Some of us trained people online. Some of it went well, some of it didn't. So when we're hiring, and if we can explain to someone, we know that you might have a little bit of a gap, a little bit of a deficit. some of the experience that you missed out on. Maybe they were 25 years old and COVID happened until they were 28. Maybe they were just finishing their education. And there's a big lost window there. And if we can show that person, we have an option, we have a possibility for you. This is how we're gonna close the gap. You're gonna have a mentor. Or we're gonna do extra side-by-side coaching with you, peer-to-peer coaching. We're gonna do something to show you how to fill that gap, the 2 years of COVID, and then that 1 or 2 year hangover after, which we're just kind of coming out of. And then next up, that's the easy one, but it's representation. It's just, when you're in an interview, if a baby boomer or a Gen X like I am interviewing someone from the other generation that is Gen Z, they might want to hear from a Gen Z. My values and my behaviors show up as my generation. So, it doesn't hurt to include others in your team. Tailored benefits. Okay, so I used to think, we all know, the benefits that we gave, they were all the same, right? Dental, medical, life insurance, and long-term disability. That's what we did. And now, most are saying, we're not that interested in that. We don't really care about that. We care about fertility benefits, bereavement leave that includes miscarriage. We want to see an employer that's showing up for mental health, giving therapy, giving more than EFAP. The EFAP is not enough. A yoga session's not enough. It's like they want more health spending and more options, and we're currently exploring it. It's very difficult because when you scrap what you have and you go to something new, it has to be something new that's worth fighting for, and that is desired. And then the last one is not very sexy, but it's just about highlighting stability. Because some of you are in firms or own firms that are very stable. It's very important to highlight your stability as well, because as much as you can have all these beautiful things and training and compensation, that stability is still really important. So let's go on to training. So, again, no surprise to Gen Z, they need very fast do-it-yourself training, right? Where they can just choose what they want on a mobile device. They want different mixed mediums. In my day, I'm really aging myself, a video that was a whole hour long made sense, but now nobody wants a 1 hour video. They want like a 4-minute video with a short snapshot and a reminder at the end. Maybe they want it to be gamified so they can earn points because they did it. Maybe they don't like gamifications. I know some people really don't like the games, but a lot of them do. They want to kind of see their stars and points grow with all the training that they do. So when they say snack size, is that first 8 seconds is really going to capture their attention. And we're redoing all of our training right now because it's all 60-minute training and nobody really wants to listen to 60 minutes. Of course, buddy systems, peer-to-peer, they don't want to learn from me or the other generation, they want to learn from each other. So creating more of that buddy system that we've all done before, but really going back to it. And then really showing what kind of AI learning you're providing. AI training is so difficult. We did an AI course for a 3-hour course with the company and with everyone. And a lot of people said, oh, that's not important to me. I don't really like it. I don't want it. But then later on, after they did it, they said, I'm glad I did. Because everyone's talking about the same thing. None of us know. And if you're sitting here thinking, I have no idea how AI is going to impact me, most employers I know really are not sure yet. They see some efficiencies. They see a few roles that might be changed. But none of us are quite there yet to really understand it. That said, we can't shy away as HR practitioners. If I wouldn't mind sharing some of the context I have around some of the training we've been doing in AI. Might be interesting if you need to bring people in to wrap your heads around it. And the last piece is really important to me because we always talk about coaching, but what I thought was coaching is definitely generational. So I would say to someone, here's a task, and can you get it done by X date? And that seems generally reasonable. But I want to do just a short game, okay? Like, it's not really a game, but maybe a role play. Soleil, do you mind being my? Okay, so I'm going to do it in my generation, okay? Soleil, you've been working on this assignment, and thanks for getting some of the project done. Here's the list of a few things I think you could do differently. Some of the details that need to get done, here's the list that I'd like to see. And when you're done, it's due next Friday. Any thoughts? Okay, good. So if you could just get going on this, get back to me. Pretty classic, very telling. Okay, so now let's take the style that Gen Z really wants to see. Can we do it again? Soleil, thank you so much for your work on that project. You're making good progress. Tell me about the project. So she tells me about it. And so do you have ideas that you'd like to bring, like an impact, something you could shift around the details, how we could lean into the customer better? Do you have some ideas? Oh, you do, okay. So tell me about the ideas. Okay, how do you suggest, Soleil, getting these ideas into this project? Show me what you think, okay. Are you open to hearing a few of my ideas? You are, okay. So I have this other idea as well, and this other idea. So if you could take your two ideas and these two suggestions and kind of marry them together, that would be amazing. Now, I think I'd love to collaborate with you. Do you think we could meet 2 or 3 days from now, do a touch point? You could tell me how you're doing, chat about it, we'll crowdsource, and work around that a little bit, okay? And so again, thanks for all the hard work you're doing. Thanks for the impact you're making. And I'll see you in a couple of days. I'll count on you to schedule that meeting. But the deadline, can you still meet it next Friday? You can, great. So that was an entirely different conversation. Don't you agree, Soleil? Did you feel differently? Yeah, it's just that my generation just wants to tell you what to do. Like, I don't want to go through the thank you and the recognition and the can you, but really, but I think when we talk about coaching, this is the crux of it, and I am struggling with this because recognition doesn't come naturally. We want to say thank you. It's not, I am an optimistic person and I want to say thank you, but sometimes we forget about recognition, and just this week I was training 3 new people that had just joined our firm. And in the training, I asked them, how's it going, and what do you like, and what do you not like? One of them said our videos training is too long. That's not surprising. But one of them said, how can I participate in the decision-making in the firm? They just started, by the way. And I'm like, okay, you just started and you want to participate in the decision-making? I'm interested. And I said, well, what kind of decision-making would you like to participate in? And they said, well, I'd like to work on some of the anti-bias work that we do and join the DI committee. That was amazing. We leaned right in. But just this element of coaching, I think, and if you only take one thing from today, Gen Z does not want to be coached my way. They want to be coached the new way. Okay, so let's move to retention. And, in retention, I was actually thinking of putting self-direction and autonomy actually ahead of compensation, because my God, this generation wants autonomy and decision-making, but compensation still looms the largest because, as we know, we want to buy homes, we want the dream. We don't want to have that second job forever. So obviously really critical. And then around mental health awareness, we talk about mental health. We hosted a webinar last week with Dr. Jennifer Dimmoff, and we talked a lot about how as leaders, we can't diagnose mental health, but we can lean into mental health. You can see when someone is not doing well and they need us, and they need more than an EFAP. They need our flexibility, they need our listening, they need our attention. And teaching leaders how to work through that mental health is difficult because our leaders might also be struggling with their mental health. 50% of Gen Z are reporting that they feel stressed all the time or most of the time. 50% feeling stressed most of the time. Not a great feeling. So let's talk about that for a second. I'm gonna go to point number 2 here, and that's about managing workplace stress. I find that with more technology, and the availability of being able to blur the lines between work and home, I think we're working more and more. Michael mentioned we hired a new CEO, that I made that decision. It was a hard decision, 35 years in my seat. It wasn't something I had initially planned to do. But I really saw that managing some of the workloads of what needs to get done towards a future to grow is really requiring a whole other space. With all the technology we have, all the disruptions, you need to be pretty darn clear on who's doing the work and how much work there is. And so we've been doing time audits, even going through individual groups and asking them to really write down the 10-minute segments of what they're working on and looking at efficiencies that could be AI, other people that are already doing similar work in the organization, or redistributing the work and saying, we have to pause this, and being okay with accepting that we have to pause some things because it's exhausting if we're always adding versus subtracting and then adding, and waiting until something is complete before we add another project. It's not an easy thing, but certainly managing workplace stress is mostly about managing work distribution. I think good leaders are good at distributing work. That takes a lot of effort. So on the first point was about value alignment. And what I really meant there is that today, due to the economic times being a little bit iffy, and yes, there are good jobs out there, but it's not the highest economy that we've seen and the highest job economy. So leaders are trying to manage performance and trying to manage humanity at the same time. And you want high trust, and you want to honor mental health, and you want to reduce workloads. But at the same time, the company has to perform, your organization has to get the work done, your customer has to be served well. And marrying those two things is not easy. But you can't have one without the other. Without economic benefit, they don't have jobs. So it kind of has to be that pairing. And leaders need our attention to help them get through that difficulty of pairing these two things together. We talked about mental health. Now, we talked about decision-making and impact through that coaching experience. Monitoring happiness. A lot of us do surveys. A lot of the surveys I think are a little bit boring, and when I get the results, I'm like, I don't know if that really speaks to me. What speaks to me is that Canada used to be in the top 10 worldwide for happiness, on happiness scores. And these are on longitudinal studies of like 200 elements of happiness across all the nations. We used to be top 10. Then we were 13th, and last year we dropped to 15th as a nation. It doesn't sound so bad being 15th in the world. But our under 30 years old, we rank 58th. Gen Z is not happy in Canada right now. And so again, back to the beginning when I was saying, well, you know, we call them entitled and we say they want to work less. But what Gen Z is experiencing is pretty dramatic. And the unhappiness, as we know, is also a cluster. When you hang out with happy people, you're happy, right? So there's kind of that cluster of unhappiness. And as leaders here in the room, we have this opportunity to be the shift in how we communicate about Gen Z, but then also leaning into it. So, you know, we talked about flexibility earlier. I won't go there as well. And finally, just recognition. I mean, I don't know about you. We've tried platforms. It's called AwardsCo, where you can give points and you can give recognition. You know, it's an interesting platform. Does it really allow for that true recognition? I asked a few of our team members lately, how do you feel about, you know, different either communication styles for recognition? And they said the most simple thank you is still the best. You know, just calling someone saying, hey, thanks for your hard work is still better than all of the performative things and points and awards and, you know, recognition. The best is just that really simple appreciation and thank you. So recently I was speaking with this author, and Olivia McGarver, she's a Canadian who wrote a book recently about generations, and she said, you know, we get older and we just become the last generation to complain about ourselves and the next generation, and that's absolutely true. So before we go on to any questions, I think just on my mind is that instead of judgment, is like replacing judgment with curiosity and replacing judgment with learning and listening. And like I said too, because I knew I was talking about this today, when I asked these 3 new people what they wanted, and they want impact, and they want decision making, and they want flexibility, and they want a clear path to compensation, and they want paths that are not only up but sideways, and they're all the things that we're talking about today, and I see it. So then I asked one of my HR team members, can you give me the names of anyone under a certain, in the generations, that I can speak with, just to learn from them? And I haven't done it yet for today. But, you know, imagine the things that they will tell me if I listen. You know, it'll change everything. So thank you, and I'd be really happy to answer questions. Not that I am an expert in generations. I'm more of the staffing and HR person who sees this happen every day in my interviews, and what the people share with me in their interview really does line up with these notions. Thank you so much.
Question.
Sure.
So we're evolving here too. So people have been having a hard time hearing the questions. So I'm not trying to make this more intimidating for someone to stand up and ask a question, by the way. That's exact opposite of what I'm trying to accomplish. But what's a question for Catherine? Well, maybe I'll, yeah, exactly.
You don't
Think
have
of something. Oh, here we go. I'd love to ask you a question, but I want to give someone else the floor. Maybe you can introduce yourself and, oh, there we go. People are freaking out. Don't come to me. It's like I've got COVID or something.
Hi, I'm Karen from Capital Office, and literally they have staff work there for 30 years, 20 years, a long time. So the question is, how do you bring new talent in to learn from these older, experienced staff members?
I really love your question, and I think all organizations are facing that, because if you're built on a company that has, like you said, the baby boomer, the Gen X, and then millennials and Gen Zs and how they interact, I mean, we're all, I think, suffering with the same thing a little bit, because you want everyone to get along, but they're saying things to the other generation intergenerationally, like, oh, you're too traditional and you're too structured, but then the other saying, like, you know, you're not following instructions, and I don't want to give you recognition for every single thing you did. And so I think the first thing I would lean into is team building. Like, and I know that sounds, I mean, obvious, but in-person team building still matters, and doing very simple team building. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but kind of in-person conversation around even having someone facilitate a conversation about how you see things. Something we did recently was an EQ workshop, and by doing EQ, you start to see your own self-awareness. You start to be able to challenge yourself a little bit on perhaps how you show up with empathy or decision-making or your behaviors. And sometimes EQ leans really nicely into generations, and it gives the opportunity for conversation. And if, again, I'll share the facilitator with you if you'd like to talk with them, but what I really liked was the facilitator would say, if you're a high empathetic person, stand up. If you have difficulty with impulse control, stand up. And so it was fun though, because everyone in the room is kind of standing and seated, but now you're starting to see, oh, like you're a really high empathetic person, but your empathy might be so empathetic that you actually can't make a decision, you're paralyzed, you know? Or maybe you're a great decision maker, but you're too assertive, and that assertiveness just isn't landing with the other generation. So almost using a different subject than generations, and instead focusing on EQ. I think that would be a really interesting way to do it. Otherwise, maybe it's just talking about it openly. I'm not sure, like even just this kind of conversation might be interesting to have together and say, how would you describe the generation? And then how can you break those thinking points? Because what we think becomes our words, and our words become our actions. So it's almost like if you can stop the thought, you can change the outcome in the action.
We got another question over here, another brave soul.
Sorry, that kind of goes to what was said there, but how do you bridge the gap between the generations when the older generation, those baby boomers that are looking at retirement and you're doing that transfer knowledge, they think a lot of these strategies, emotional intelligence, all that stuff is a little bit of woo-woo stuff, and I don't really want to get involved with that.
Well, it is a little bit woo-woo. But I'm going to go there for a second. I'm not sure that I was someone who would have said that I would actually lean into this subject. I might have been the person who thought it was woo-woo. Not that long ago, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But I don't know about you, but COVID did change something for me. And as you started to listen to people differently, you saw differences show up. And even someone who's really stoic and thinks that all of it is woo-woo, I think they can still be brought to learning in whatever style it is. For me, what taught me was doing a 360 and kind of really seeing my strengths and weaknesses, doing EQ and doing some coaching that's a little bit more forward, not as, you know, the coaching style that is not necessarily the one we were practicing, but just really saying to me, this is where you're really performing well and this is where you're not. And this is how you can impact the business in a different way with your strengths and really leaning into your strengths. So I think when we think about someone who's really just not able to shift their mindset or their actions or their thinking, if they're affecting the company's performance or they're affecting morale or it's becoming toxic, then you're really dealing with the toxic employee. You're not really dealing with their generation. And in that case, I wonder what it would look like to lean into, what would it look like for you to be optimistic? What would it look like for you to be someone who brings their best self to work? And who brings their best self not just to your peers of the same age and style, but to everyone, because we all have affinity bias, we all do. If we look at our friends, we absolutely accidentally find ourselves hanging out with the same people of the same age and education. And when you challenge yourself and you really open it up and you see that your friendships can be so much broader and interesting, but when that happens in the workplace, that affinity bias starts to really affect how everybody else feels around them. And affinity biases are hard to break because we all have them. But if you can recognize the bias in yourself, I think it can shift something. And I don't think anyone can't learn. Even my father. I had a great conversation with him this week. He's 81. He's such a beautiful man. And he started to tell me that, you know, women, you know, sometimes they leave the workplace because they want to. And you know, I had to say, Dad, you know, sometimes they want to, but sometimes they want to stay working, but it's impossible for them to keep going under the circumstances that exist around that Henry Ford model of work, that it's a 5-day work week, both parents are out of the house, they have young children at home, they're sick, it's not easy. I mean, we've all faced these things. But to lean in. And then my dad we started writing down hours and talking about this subject again, because today was coming, I was telling him about it. And at the end of the conversation, he said, I see your point of view. I didn't really see it like that, because when I worked with women, they always left the workforce, and I thought they did because they wanted to. And he saw then in that moment, yeah, maybe there was a possibility they would have stayed in the workforce had we given them that opportunity. My dad needed like a 1.5-hour conversation with a little bit of there's a bit of fever in the room, you know? And it was actually really interesting. And I think people are changeable. It might take time, but I think it's even for the woohoos, I think it's worthwhile.
For one last question, give us your name too and where you're from.
Kaylee, and I'm from the Ottawa area. I'm actually a single parent looking for work right now and struggling with a 4-year-old at home. And one of the things that I've kind of seen again and again and again for the last year, 6 months, et cetera, is that we talk a lot about how that 9 to 5 doesn't match the female population, and how mothers are struggling, and how people are having babies later, and they're not having as many babies because they're not able to work. But I don't see any restructuring on how these roles and work roles could be either shared with somebody that's senior that's maybe only wanting to work part-time, or bringing them in a way that works for everybody. And I'm not hearing that, and I'm hearing a lot of people saying that there's an issue here, and that there's a gap, and that their husbands are excelling at the career and they're staying home and doing the child rearing, and they're not excelling in the career or taking a break, et cetera. And I'm just maybe tired of hearing the problem and not the solution. And I'm wondering, where can we get that? Where can the solution be?
I admire your question. And if you're looking for work, I don't know if you noticed, but Altus is here, Adecco's here, several good staffing firms are here. You might want to go have a conversation with a few of them and see what doors you can open. But your question is kind of the one I was referring to too, is that our work model doesn't match. And the people making the decisions on our work model are part of a generation that had that high optimism. And I agree with you that it would be lovely to see things change with more compressed work weeks, or shorter work weeks, or more shared jobs, like maybe 2 people, Soleil does half and I do half, if there was a possibility of sharing a job. I don't know that that'll shift if the CEOs today are mostly baby boomers. 50% of our leadership across Canada are my generation, Gen X. So that basically, the people making the decisions might not be those that are experiencing that in that moment. And those preferring remote work right now are millennials, because a lot of times they are parents with children at home. And so I will say that I don't think it hasn't changed at all. I think I've seen a lot more flexibility in people saying, oh, it's okay that you have to go pick up your child at school and then log on a little bit later for a half hour or whatever. Personally, I see a lot more flexibility than what I provided as an employer 30 years ago. I think all of us are acknowledging that things have shifted. So I won't say that it hasn't changed fully, but it's only changed like this much. And that change will only come when the millennials become the bosses. I think as it shifts from the 2 generations that we're in to the leadership being millennials, hopefully you'll retain this in your mind and you'll act on it. I don't know that the current generation will act on that shift. I don't know if that wasn't very optimistic, but it might take a little while, I guess, is my point. But I think it'll come, but it'll take the millennials to make the change.
Thank you for sharing, Kaylee.
you.
Catherine, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here. Proof positive why we picked you for CEO of the Year, and you're running these best managed companies. It's on display yet again, Catherine. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you for sharing this knowledge and letting us know how to coach Gen Z generation better.